Excellent. So, hi everyone. My name is Frédéric Viguet. I'm a member of the faculty at NYU and director of the Institute of French Studies, one of the partners in organizing this, putting together this conference. I want to echo my partners in saying that it's been a real pleasure to prepare this conference together with Tom Darmon and Emirbayer from Colombia, with Gisèle Sapiro from the Centre Européen de Sociologie et de Sciences Politiques, with Emily Apter, chair of the French department, with Stefanos Geroulanos, our host today from the Remark Institute, and many thanks to Stefanos and to Samantha Paul, who did all of the heavy lifting and without whom this conference would not have been possible. So our panel, our second panel of the day is entitled Habitus Inflexibility, in parenthesis, thinking with and beyond Bourdieu about individual, class, gender, race, mobilities. So 2 decades after Pierre Bourdieu's death, the goal of this panel is to engage with the notion of habitus, and particularly Bourdieu's insistence that the habitus is durable, somewhat inflexible, and has a limited capacity to be reshaped. Since Pierre Bourdieu died, his concept has had an extraordinary legacy in France in literature. We referred to it this morning in the talks given by Sylvain Guyot and Morgane Cadieux, with an extraordinary literary success, Annie Ernaux, Didier Ribon, Edouard Louis. But the concept has been also particularly fertile in French sociology, from Bernard Lahire, who criticized it but still wanted to hold on to a dispositionalist theory, to Wilfrid Ligné and Muriel Darmon, who will be with us today who sort of prolonged Bourdieu while probing the ability of the concept, the concept and probing empirically its ability to change over the life course. So that's one aspect that we wanted to discuss. But on the other hand, Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus was primarily centered on class habitus, just like his theory of the social space. And other forms of domination, such as race or gender or sexuality or age, remain less explored in Bourdieu's work. This is not to say that his theory is incompatible with a stronger engagement with those other aspects of domination. This is just to say that he didn't do much of that work himself. And so what are we to do then with the concept of habitus when thinking, and especially across this side of the Atlantic, about the gendered and racial dimension of the social space, and thinking also about the various movements that endeavor to challenge the gendered order and or the racial order. So I'm going to briefly introduce, in the interest of time, our speakers, and I'll start with Muriel Darmon. So Muriel was always Hello, Muriel. You're now big on our screen. Welcome. Muriel was always going to join us remotely. Unlike Chantal Jacquet, who was prevented from coming at the very last minute by a canceled flight, there are some crumbles of fight against neoliberalism in France, and that results in unfortunate strikes in airports, and Chantal was prevented from coming. Muriel Darmon is a sociologist and a research director at the French Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS. She has been affiliated with the Centre Européen de Sociologie et de Sciences Politiques for a little while. Her work deals with the processes of socialization and with the production and transformation of the habitus. In Becoming Anorexic, a sociological study, which was first published in 2003 and then came out in English in 2016, Muriel examined the formation of somatic anorexic dispositions. In Classe préparatoire, which has not been translated, La fabrique d'une jeunesse dominante, which was published in 2015. She explored the kind of habitus produced by elite schools, the classe préparatoire, and in particular, the disposition to put oneself constantly at work. In her more recent book, Réparer les cerveaux, Fixing Brains, Sociologie des pertes et des récupérations post-AVC, Muriel studies what happens when the body that is shaped by the habitus comes to fail, and she examines what happens to patients who have suffered a stroke, and she considers the outcome of the rehab work they undergo with specific attention to class and to gender. And finally, earlier this year, in January 2024, Muriel's book Socialization, which came out first in French, was translated into English and came out with Polity. And it's a book that, while drawing on a wide variety of empirical examples, is a systematic and theoretical analysis of how societies form and transform individuals, how the various layers of socialization through the lifetime interconnect with one another. The book is also, I want to say, a model of what translating the social sciences might mean, because Muriel deeply adapted the French version by changing the empirical examples discussed in the English language to ensure that the English version would really resonate with English readers. And her talk today is entitled, How Can the Inflexible Habitus Be Flexible? ? Muriel, la parole est à toi.
Yes, not the floor, because I'm not here, actually.
But you're still muted. Is this something that
Is it better?
Yes.
Okay, super. Yes, I was saying the floor is not mine because I'm not here, but thank you so much, Frédéric, for this very generous introduction. I feel I've got not a lot of things to say any longer, since you said already a lot. But so I'm trying to share my screen now. It worked well at first, but is it okay now? Do you see the, yes, I can see, and you probably want to see this.
Perfect.
Okay, super. Well, so thank you, Frédéric, and also thank you so much to the organizers for their invitation to participate in such an exciting panel. And sorry to be online. Actually, how I came to take a pass on an opportunity to come to New York in the spring and rather stay in France to support my son in his first year of med school would be an interesting case study of the effects of parental socialization of an individual. How one comes to see as reasonable and as the best course of action something that is objectively crazy. My former self would have deemed it as such, in a process both dependent and independent from a primary gender and class habitus, mine. But we don't have much time, so I won't dwell on this quite self-centered example in particular, and rather, without further ado, I will tackle a more general question. How can the inflexible habitus be flexible? As we may all know here, habitus is a system of structuring dispositions that underpins the practices and viewpoints of an individual or a class of individuals. The habitus is constituted through the incorporation of social conditions and past experiences, particularly from childhood. During childhood, social structures are transposed into the family and then inscribed in children's minds and bodies through their everyday life. So, Bourdieu, sorry, I will read it in English, but through the economic and social necessity that they bring to bear on the relatively autonomous world of the domestic economy and family relations, or more precisely, through the specifically familial manifestations of this external necessity, forms of the division of labor between the sexes, household objects, modes of consumption, parent-child relations, etc. the structures characterizing a determinate class of conditions of existence produce the structures of the habitus, which in their turn are the basis of the perception and appreciation of all subsequent experiences. According to the theory of habitus, primary inculcation in the family results in particularly stable products that are resistant to transformation. Bourdieu refers to the hysteresis of habitus that is constituted during family education, borrowing the term hysteresis from physics, where it refers to a lag between cause and effect and a phenomenon that continues after its cause has disappeared. By extension, it is used in this context to describe the inertia of acquired dispositions, the resistance to change, and the individual's tendency to persist in the direction taken by family education. The process selecting the places one goes to and the places one avoids, the events that matter and those one knows nothing about, the people who can be frequented and those to be avoided, is continuous, almost invisible, and often takes place beneath the level of conscious decision-making. It tends to protect the habitus from crises. Depending on the case, this kind of process can be particularly imperceptible because it relates to people's conditions of existence, for example, the spatial segregation that tends to group together similar individuals, or, on the contrary, it can be more conscious and deliberate, relating to educational strategies, for example, parental desires to avoid bad company and unsuitable books. Family inculcation, therefore, produces irreversible dispositions, if by that term we mean not, and Bourdieu means not, a definitive disposition, but rather a disposition which cannot itself be repressed or transformed, except by an irreversible process producing in turn a new irreversible disposition. From this perspective, it is therefore possible for the dispositions acquired during family inculcation to be repressed or transformed. But such a transformation requires very particular conditions capable of countering the hysteresis of family inculcation, hence the paradox of this irreversible but not so irreversible. It is all the more, it points to the amount of work that is necessary. It is all the more improbable and difficult since any new process of incorporation of dispositions must allow for the results of primary incorporation, i.e., what it has made of the individual. Primary inculcation, which is carried out, and I'm quoting Bourdieu again and Passeron, which is carried out by pedagogical work without any antecedent, produces a primary habitus, which is the basis for the subsequent formation of any other habitus. For example, and par excellence, the habitus acquired in the family determines how school education will be received and assimilated. So if there is a school habitus, it will be after and it will be fashioned by the primary family habitus. So theoretically, the question of the transformation of the habitus is clearly constructed and answered by Bourdieu, albeit paradoxically, since processes within the social world are supposed to be able to replace irreversible dispositions by other irreversible dispositions. As a scientific and more empirical, as you said, Fred, at the beginning, and more empirical question, though, I suggest the analysis of the flexibility of the habitus can benefit from using the notion of socialization, that is, using it more than Bourdieu himself did, even if the notion appears sometimes in his texts. Full disclosure, but you said it already, I'm a bit partial to the notion of socialization, on which I have just published a defense and illustration at Polit Press, translated by Lucy Garnier, from which this talk is largely drawn. In that Bourdieusian and before that Durkheimian tradition, socialization can be defined as a sociogenesis of the dispositions that constitute the habitus. What I want to suggest here is that analyzing things in terms of socialization makes it possible to think with Bourdieu, rather than beyond, actually, the flexibility of the habitus throughout the life course. In this sense, socialization refers to all the processes through which an individual is built by the local and global society in which they live. Processes during which they incorporate socially situated ways of acting, thinking, and being. The simplest definition that can be given of socialization, rather than the sociogenesis of the dispositions that constitute the habitus, is the following: the way society forms and transforms individuals. Arguably, this definition raises more problems than it solves, and in doing so, it points to some of the tasks facing analysis of socialization. The vague term way must be replaced with actual concrete processes. How does socialization operate? The abstract overarching term society must be replaced by agents of socialization. Who or what is doing the socializing? And the generic reference to the actions of socialization upon individuals must be replaced by the analysis of its specific effects, products, contents, and results. What does the socialized individual incorporate? Socialization forms us, body and soul, but it also transforms us. And this dialectical relationship between the shaping and reshaping of the individual is at the heart of the approach of the habitus I advocate. I emphasize the fact that socialization determines who we are and that its products become embedded within the individuals and are able to resist the passing of time, hysteresis, but I also underline the fact that socialization processes continue throughout the life course. One question, therefore, emerges from this dual perspective. What is the relationship between these different processes of socialization and how do they fit together? Answering this question means considering first how they are interconnected synchronically when several agents of socialization coexist at a given moment in time. For example, during childhood, when parents, extended family, peers, professional educators, and generalized educational norms must all be taken into account. And second, how they are interconnected diachronically when varied socialization processes follow on from one another and not only form, but also transform the individual. For example, in the family, at school, and in professional training establishments, in peer groups in childhood and in adulthood, in couples, in employment settings, in political or religious organizations, and this list is by no means exhaustive. The notion of continuous socialization is sometimes put forward as a remedy against conceptions of socialization or habitus that are viewed as too deterministic, because it seems to offer a way of diluting the effects of agents of socialization over a long time period, leaving more room for allegedly independent individual action. This is not the point of view I defend when I combine continuous socialization with the concept of habitus, and I take, in fact, the opposite theoretical stance, but by aiming at showing the intensity of socialization even when potentially continuous. So if we want to think with Bourdieu the flexibility of the habitus through socialization, we have to devise a model in which socialization can be conceived of as a process that is both strong and continuous. To do so, I suggest building an axis of degrees of transformation. In reproduction, Bourdieu and Passeron draw a contrast between conversion, the complete substitution of one habitus for another, and confirmation, the maintenance or reinforcement of prior socialization with later socialization. This constitutes, as I've just said, an axis that I will now briefly present, axis along which socialization can be analyzed with many intermediate positions existing between these two extremes. Within the model of continuous socialization, a given socialization operation can be a powerful person-shaping process without necessarily being transformative, and such processes that above all fix in place the primary habitus can be referred to as reinforcement socialization. Gender socialization offers many examples of reinforcement socialization. It could even be argued that, to a large extent, the strengths of gender socialization and the hysteresis of its products are the result of the series of fixing processes composing it over the life course. This can be seen, for example, in the way that masculine socialization is reinforced by socializing agents such as family, school, university, the peer group, sports, or the army, for example. Cases of gender socialization that do not reinforce prior socialization are certainly less common, but they nonetheless can be studied through a socialization lens. For example, trans men or trans women encounter successive gender socialization of the life course that are not always reinforcement socialization. I won't dwell on this since I have an inkling that Emmanuel, hello Emmanuel, will tackle this question, Emmanuel Beaubatie. At the other end of the spectrum to these forms of reinforcement socialization are the processes referred to as conversion socialization, that is to say, processes that effect total and radical transformations on the model and secularization of religious conversion. And I think that this notion of conversion was mentioned earlier this morning, this morning for you, if I'm not mistaken. Bourdieu and Passeron use the Greek word metanoia to emphasize the radical nature of these transformations. The term means conversion and involves the idea of mutation and rebirth. In the context of a series of habitus, particularly advanced deculturating, sorry, it's quite difficult, and reculturating techniques are necessary in order to produce a habitus as similar as possible to that produced in the earliest phase of life, while having to reckon with a pre-existing habitus. Or, in other words, those used previously, to replace irreversible dispositions with other irreversible dispositions. In my own research, I have tried to understand how such radical conversions were even possible given the strengths of primary socialization and hysteresis. For example, I applied this approach to the anorexic conversion career, and I discussed also the relevance of the notion of conversion regarding the power of transformation of the members held by total, or let's say totalish institutions like preparatory classes in France. The topic of conversion seems to have fascinated a great many sociologists, and me also, actually, even though the conversions are probably not particularly frequent in real life. As such, their analysis serves as an extreme case in the light of which less pronounced but more common situations of socialization can also be examined. All those that do not result in the total and radical transformation of the individual, but nevertheless do not simply confirm and reinforce past socialization. All these processes that transform the individual to some degree or other, on some level or other, can thus be described as transformative socialization, which is by definition limited compared to what a conversion process would entail. I usually take, to illustrate this point, the case of class defectors, whose trajectories are often seen as conversion and a radical transformation of the child's whole person and working class taste or allegiances. But transformation here may well be limited to very circumscribed area of practices, literature or culture, for example, and primary class socialization may well continue to determine practices in other practical domains like sports or food practices, attitudes towards time or institution, etc. But on this also I won't dwell in order not to anticipate too much on the panel. In my own research instead, I can use examples on different, examples as different as commercial weight loss group and post-brain stroke rehabilitation facilities. They count on the total and radical transformation of their working class members. In the first case, their eating habits, but also more generally, their daily lives, sociability, domestic arrangement, etc. And patients, in the second case, also brain stroke, the relationship to impairment, to learning, to daily organization, to the written word, to improvisation and planning, etc. Such conversion by commercial weight loss group or rehabilitation units, such conversion, in fact, prove impossible, especially because they presuppose certain relationships to the written word, to learning, or to the world that are those of the middle and upper classes with significant levels of cultural capital, rather than those of the working class people these two institutions generally deal with. Consequently, the transformations that are nevertheless affected by these institutional processes of socialization remain limited to practices or areas that are compatible with the pre-existing working class disposition of their members or patients. Given that reinforcement socialization exists, it is perfectly possible to be continuously socialized without being continuously transformed. Similarly, given that transformative socialization exists, it is also possible to be transformed by a socialization process without being transformed completely or definitively. Socialization can therefore be strong and continuous. Moreover, the continuous nature of society's actions upon the individual does not necessarily erase the essential and over-determining nature of certain agents or moments in individual social construction, but rather repositions them within a longer and more varied process. Let's move now to my conclusion. So this is how the inflexible habitus can be flexible. Socialization is therefore a conceptual tool through which it is possible to understand how and why we act as we act, think as we think, become what we are, and how habitus can be transformed. Diverse criticisms have been leveled against the concept of socialization, dispositions, and habitus since the 1960s. The main arguments contended they were too deterministic, failed to allow for agency and individual or social change. Regarding the latter, I tried to show how habitus and socialization could, on the contrary, enable us to precisely study individual transformation. Far from being a relic of the past, the sociology of habitus through socialization may well be exactly what sociology needs today to move forward. So socialization is an empirically grounded notion able to describe and explain both the reproduction and the transformation of society via individuals who are defined by their positions in the social space of class, gender, and/or race. On this last point, this was not the subject of my talk today, since I focused on the flexibility or inflexibility of the habitus, but I have no doubt the sociology of habitus via sociology of socialization processes can meet the challenges raised today by recent development, both in sociological and historical scholarship and in the social world, and make it possible to think about flexibility when it comes to class or gender or race, to quote the argument of the panel. I do think it possible, both theoretically and empirically, to analyze with Bourdieu rather than beyond, and without watering down the deterministic stance of the habitus, questions like gender performance and gender fluidity, or race as identity and as incorporation, to name just a few of the questions I'm trying to raise and hopefully to answer, for example, in the last chapter of my book on socialization. And with this last shameless bit of self-promotion, I leave the floor to the next speakers I am really eager to hear. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Muriel. I'm now going to turn it over to Emmanuel Beaubatie, but I'm first going to introduce you, Emmanuel. Emmanuel Beaubatie is a sociologist, researcher at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS, in France, and the Centre Européen de Sociologie et de Sciences Politiques. Emmanuel works on gender and sexuality, combining feminist studies with concepts and methods from the Bourdieusian sociology of social class. Emmanuel's research explores the multiplicity of gender beyond the binary, as well as gender mobilities and bifurcations over the course of life. His work is based on mixed methods, both qualitative and quantitative, and his PhD, defended in 2017, was devoted to trans trajectories as an experience of gender mobility. The PhD became a book published first in 2021 and recently republished, Transfuge de sexe, Passer les frontières du genre, which came out with La Découverte. More recently, just this year, Emmanuel authored an essay, Ne suis-je pas une féministe, question mark, which came out with Le Seuil. Emmanuel's talk today is entitled Moving Across the Social Space of Gender, Reflections from a Study on Gender Mobility in Trans Path. And with that, Emmanuel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you today for this introduction. Thank you for the invitation and for all the work of the organization around this event. So I'm going to start with a disclaimer, or maybe a question, which is that I don't work specifically with the notion of habitus in Bourdieu, but I do study gender mobility and multiplicity, which obviously raises important questions about habitus. So today I'm going to present some reflections that began with my PhD on trans trajectories, and that I'm still pursuing now, but this time in the general population. So when I started working on trans trajectories, I realized that they were primarily studied through the prism of identity. They're often studied as a gender minority in terms of their trajectories of gender identity. So they're considered above all as the T of LGBT. But from a sociological point of view, and even though I came from gender and sexuality studies, it seemed to me that there was more to it than just that. So I worked with mixed methods, both statistics and biographical interviews. And when I started interviewing trans people, one thing was really striking is that their stories had a lot in common with those of people who have changed social class during the course of their lives. In the social sciences, we did not have a large body of literature on gender-based social mobility. Gender is still often naturalized, so changing gender is almost never conceived as an experience of social mobility. However, sociologist Kristen Shield has to some extent sensed that trans people experience a form of mobility, since she has compared the occupational situations of trans men and women before and after transition. She has shown, for instance, that trans men gain economic and symbolic benefits at work, even if their careers are not comparable to those of cisgender men. But she did not really investigate this idea of mobility. So in this research, I have tried to show how trans people experience gender mobility on an individual biographical level. But their mobility is special compared to class mobility because they're at the same time joining a minority, stigmatized and discriminated against by the very fact of their mobility. So for me, it was important to study the link between their experience of belonging to this minority and that of mobility. And in studying the gender mobilities of trans people, I came to the observation that these mobilities can have a diversity of natures and amplitudes. There aren't just two sides to mobility. It's not just about moving from the female to the male category or vice versa. And it all depends on what we mean by male or female. Trans people have a diversity of gender self-identifications, male, female, non-binary, queer, etc. But it was very important to me to go further than just identities. Trans people, just as cisgender people, have a diversity of gender practices and therefore of gender lifestyles. And this observation led me to go further in the analogy I was exploring between gender and class. This led me to Pierre Bourdieu's concept of social space. And that's how I really came to think with Bourdieu, actually. It was that more than the mobility aspect, because in his work, mobilities remain very improbable, exceptional, and they often strengthen social reproduction rather than subvert it, which eventually I found is also the case for gender. And we'll come back to that. So there's a strong force of inertia in Bourdieu's social space, but sometimes mobilities can happen and they can have very different starting points and destinations. A number of studies suggest that gender should be conceived as a scale ranging from femininity to masculinity. And these gender scales can be found in a number of surveys today. But this approach is quite linear in terms of gender stratification. With Bourdieu, that's not the perspective I'm trying to pursue. Instead, I try to explore a multidimensional and a relational approach to gender in order to go beyond the binary. So today, I'd like to return to these two concepts, gender mobility and the social space of gender. I'll go back over a few elements of my PhD, but I'll also try to show more generally how these concepts can help us think about gender differently. So first, about gender mobility. The title of my thesis and the book based on it is Transfuge de sexe, sex or gender defectors, as we might say in English, but with an even more negative connotation in English. Maybe Chantal Jacquet would have said transsex or transgender, with which I agree. But we will need to talk about this because I now work on the general population and I can't say transgender because transgender means trans. So yeah, would have worked before, but not yet. So back to this notion of transfuge de sexe, it's not entirely absent from feminist studies and sociology. Some research have evoked this possibility in the field of sexuality, education, and labor. It was philosopher Monique Wittig who first spoke of lesbians as transfuge de sexe in 1980. For her, lesbians are not or no longer women because they don't occupy the same social position as heterosexual women in the sexual order. They don't have or no longer have the same domestic, reproductive, conjugal, and sexual status, the same practices, and I might add the same lifestyles and styles of femininity as heterosexual women. This is what led Wittig to shorten Simone de Beauvoir's famous sentence. Wittig simply writes, "One is not born a woman, period." In other words, one doesn't necessarily become one. If you're a lesbian, you may not become one, or at least you may experience a gender mobility. 10 years later, French sociologists working on gender, education, and labor, Anne-Marie Donne-Richard and Catherine Marie, made a second reference to transfuge de sexe. At the time, they were working on the subject of young girls entering technical fields, and they wondered whether these girls could be described as transfuge de sexe, since they were going to occupy masculine positions on the labor market. Their answer is nuanced because for the most part, these girls had already received an atypical gender socialization in their families, and therefore they had already previously developed a taste for activities coded as masculine. So we have research that evoked the possibility of individual gender mobility in connection with sexuality, education, and labor. And in trans trajectories also, gender mobilities can involve these dimensions. Kristen Shield has shown this with labor. I've illustrated it with sexuality. I've shown that transgender mobilities occur through sexuality before, during, and after transition. Sexual orientations and practices have gendered significations, and because of that, sexuality has the power to do and to undo gender. For example, going back to Monique Wittig, for a future trans man, becoming a lesbian already means no longer being truly a woman, which is probably why most trans men are lesbians before their transition, whereas for trans women it's different. Half of them were heterosexual men before, and even the gay ones were still clearly men at the time. And then, during the transition and after, sexual orientations, desires, and practices change because they contribute to the mobility itself. For example, many trans women who were heterosexual men before now have male partners as women, and this is linked to the fact that heterosexuality as a woman is a very powerful fabric of femininity. And for trans men, 1/3 of them also do have male partners after, even if many were lesbians before. Being a gay man, embodying a subordinate masculinity, as sociologist Raywin Connell would say, appears to be a way to compose with the tension of the upward mobility by reducing its amplitude and not embracing heterosexual hegemonic masculinity. And I will come back to this tension later. So sexual dispositions can change during the transition, but very often they do not radically change. There is a hysteresis effect in gender and sexual socializations, obviously. For instance, lesbian dispositions remain after transition, and this can have implications, for instance, in terms of sexual prevention, risk perception for those who become gay men. But desire do not necessarily change. In fact, in many trajectories, the gender significations of sexuality change more than the practices themselves. Beyond the sexuality aspect, I have also shown that gender mobilities do not take place at the same age, the same pace, and the same price, depending on the starting point and the direction. Trans women transition later in life than trans men, and they experience much more immediate violence and precariousness. Whereas trans men at the start are tolerated as tomboys, but not for very long. More generally, and despite these differences, I found that the treatment of all trans mobilities tended to demonstrate the strength of gender social frontiers, of gender reproduction, and especially the reproduction of masculinity as exclusive from any form of femininity. Gender mobility also have a subjective price, and this price seems to be more important for those who experience a gender promotion, as it is for many people who experience an upward mobility, as Bourdieu has described and experimented himself. Generally, trans men and women are aware of the privileges that have been gained or lost, but their experiences are not the same. For trans women, becoming a woman and being treated as such leads to reflexivity on their past as men, but there is no tension in their current experience of womanhood. For trans men, it's different. Many had difficulties with the very category of men, preferring to call themselves boys, queer, non-binary. It's not uncommon for them to exclude themselves voluntarily from all male spaces, which is one of the places where domination is reproduced among men. It's not easy for trans men to be just one of the guys, the title of Kristen Schultz's book. I found a lot of guilt, a feeling of betrayal, which contributed to forging non-hegemonic gender positions and styles of masculinity. In terms of practices, many do not fully embody masculinity in terms of body modifications, body hexes, and many do not legally inscribe their mobility by a sex change in civil status, on which depend their full recognition as men by the state, institutions, and in everyday interactions. But the comparison between trans men and women is not enough to describe their gender positions, because these mobilities can take different directions. There can be obvious mobilities, but also smaller mobility that are less visible, more horizontal, And there are, of course, a lot of gender mobilities that are not transgender mobilities. And these are some of the reasons why I've come to the notion of social space. I came to it first because I interviewed not just trans men and women, but also non-binary people. So I documented the diversity of transgender identifications, but again, I didn't want it to come down to just identity. I wanted to document what sociologist Rowin Connell, in her work on masculinities, calls configurations of gender practices. Configurations of practices that forge what I call gender positions. Rowin Connell doesn't work centrally with Bourdieu. I mean, she does, but it seemed to me that her approach enables a real dialogue with him because they share a relational conception of social positions. But above all, the notion of social space has been a way for me to go beyond the binary and to do it without leaving behind the concept of domination. I approach Bourdieu's work in La Distinction as a way to explore how social classes cannot be reduced to two classes forged by a single economic dimension, in other words, by a place in the division of labor. In terms of gender, the project of thinking beyond the binary has not really been pursued in these multidimensional terms in feminist studies. First of all, the gender binary model is still very prevalent, especially in France. Materialist feminism, inspired by Marxism, remains very dominant because it emerged in France. And in the materialist approach, there are only two classes of sex defined by an economic dimension, by their place in the gender division of labor, and there is no mobility. But the plurality of gender has been explored later, for instance, in intersectional approaches. These approaches looked at the articulation between gender, race, and class, including on the subject of labor. They demonstrated the internal diversity of the class of women, the diversity of their experiences of male domination according to their racial and class background. And finally, queer studies emerged and developed a post-structuralist perspective with more emphasis on discourse and on symbolic aspects. Moving away from labor, they insisted on the role of sexuality in gender construction. And it was queer studies that really made it possible to show the porosity of gender and sexual frontiers and the possibility of circulating, passing, and subverting the categories of men and women. So the plurality of gender has been investigated, but gender has not yet been considered as a social space. Feminist scholars have not really taken up Bourdieu's critique and discussion of the materialist perspective. The analogical gesture of materialist feminists was not pursued with this model, even if many feminists like Leslie McCall, Lois McClain, Torel Moy, Viviane Albanga, Kate Trapas, etc., do work with other concepts like the notion of cultural. So this is the approach I'm trying to pursue. I'm beginning to do it with the general population, but I started with the trans population using, among other methods, the traditional tool to map a social space, which is multiple correspondence analysis. I've shown how there can be a diversity of configurations of gender practices. I already mentioned a few, but it will be very different in the general population. So body practices, administrative and legal practices, self-expression, sexuality, which is an important one, sociability, activism, etc. And these different poles and groups of position correspond to different ways of being and thinking about gender, some ways being more legitimate than others, and the different groups judging each other on that matter, just as sociologist Beverly Skeggs has shown among cisgender women. And just like her, I also found that these gender positions were situated in terms of class and race. I observed, for example, how people with the most cultural capital tend to experience gender in a more fluid, less binary way than others, and to defend this fluid and non-binary conception, even though it's less legitimate. I was also able to observe how economic capital enabled more thinkable and quick access to certain respectable gender positions. Basically, the configurations of practices were also the configurations of gender practices were also configurations of class practices. And in this space, there were gender distinctions, but also class distinctions based on gender and sexuality. And at the same time, I also understood that a gender mobility is often also a class and a racial mobility. For example, I understood that the upward mobility of white trans men was not comparable to that of black trans men, to those of black trans men, because black trans men have even more professional and administrative difficulties than before when they were women. So for me, these findings raise a fundamental question, which is how can we link the multidimensional approach of the social space on the one hand and the intersectional approach on the other hand? And I will conclude with considerations related to this question. As sociologists, we're aware of the existence of class mobilities, but when it comes to gender and race, we often present it as a matter of passing. But the notion of passing can sometimes renaturalize gender and race. If you pass, it can mean that you're not authentically what you pass for. But if we denaturalize, then we're able to study social mobilities of gender or race, even if they're very improbable, and even if people's habitus is not that flexible after all. These mobilities can be diverse due to the multidimensionality of social space, but also due to the entanglement of gender, race, and class. And this leads to two research questions. The first one, if we consider the social space of gender alone, what are the main dimensions that structure this social space? And the second, if we consider the articulation between gender, race, and class, is it possible to objectify an intersectional social space and intersectional social positions and mobilities? I will stop now soon, but with two final words. First on researching minorities, and then on Bourdieu and feminist studies. It's important to say that working with Bourdieu on reproduction, socialization, and particularly on habitus, is perceived by many trans movements and individuals as a risk, and sometimes as violence, because research can be instrumentalized to reassign people to their origins and to deny them social and human rights. And this raises an ethical question, which is what is at stake sociologically, but also politically, when we produce theory by drawing from the lives of minorities, including cisgender women. Sometimes we must be careful and combine different approaches to ensure that we can do justice to these lives we study. And this is one of the reasons why, as I said earlier, it was difficult for me to use the concept of habitus in my previous research, and why I work with Bourdieu, but also necessarily at the same time with feminist studies, and especially intersectional and queer perspectives, even now, when I'm no longer working on trans trajectories. And one last word on feminism, beyond the subject of trans. It's also important to say that working with Bourdieu is not always a given when you come from feminist studies in France. Many American, English, and Australian feminist scholars have appropriated Bourdieu, but it's less the case in France. Maybe because it was Bourdieu's homeland, and probably because of the book Masculine Domination, which was much criticized by French feminists with quite legitimate reasons. So there are still a lot of bridges to build on both parts to be able to really think with Bourdieu in France in a feminist perspective. So these are two additional reasons why I'm very pleased to be able to discuss this with you today. Thank you again for the invitation and for your attention.
Many thanks, Emmanuel. Chantal Jacquet is a historian of philosophy and professor of philosophy at the Université de Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. She has authored very many books, in particular on Spinoza. And I'll mention among the very many ones only L'unité du corps et de l'esprit, affect, action, passion chez Spinoza, which was published in 2004. In 2014, Chantal, Jacquet authored Les Transclass ou la non-reproduction, and the book came out last year in 23 with Verso Books. And as the title suggests, Chantal Jacquet's book starts with the fact that social reproduction is not an iron law, that there are exceptions to it that must be accounted for. And the book aims to understand the passage from one social class to another and to forge a method to approach these cases, which in Chantal's view remain a blind spot in the theory of, in the Bourdieu's theory of social reproduction. Her talk today is entitled Beyond the Notion of Class Defector, the Concept of Transclass. Chantal, I'll turn it over to you.
Many thanks for your invitation and your presentation, Frederic. I'm sorry to be with you virtually and to offer you a virtual garden too. Sorry. In the logic of practice, Bourdieu stresses how socialization shapes an habitus by leading individuals to incorporate rules of conduct and thinking in order to adapt to their conditions of existence. These rules will govern future conduct and strategies without necessarily being conscious or deliberately followed. The habitus, therefore, is the matrix of conduct. It defines a way of life based primarily on class distinction and emerges as the very blood of life of reproduction. Thus, no one is born a worker or boss. One becomes such from father to son, or mother to daughter, or at most. In fact, the implacable logic of reproduction leaves exceptional cases in the shadows. And not the least of the paradoxes is that its principal theorist eluded in practice since he freed himself or was freed from the constraint of the class he was born into. The son of a mail carrier and later postmaster and a mother from a peasant family, Bourdieu followed a social trajectory he was not predisposed to, given its origins. How do we explain that some individual like him do not necessarily reproduce the conduct of their class, but pass from one class to another? Though it preserves margin of freedom, the habitus incites to reproduction and cannot in itself, by itself, explain non-reproduction. Such anomalies remain a blind spot in the theory of reproduction, and the issue is how to account for them, how social non-reproduction is possible, and how to understand the singularity of exceptions in a process where things seem doomed to the repetition of the same. Firstly, I will examine a possible blind spot in the theory of reproduction, and secondly, I will exercise what I will call a right of inventory with regard to Bourdieu's inheritance. Blind spot in the theory of reproduction, question mark. Remarkably, sketch for self-analysis doesn't ponder why Bourdieu did not reproduce the family model. Although it provides the key for understanding his intellectual history and his focus on sociology instead of philosophy, when admitted to the École Normale Supérieure and the aggregation, Bourdieu does not look into the background factors contributing to his academic success and social ascent. Instead, his reflection begins with analysis of the intellectual climate in Paris during the 50s. The only biographical elements he includes are those required to explain his subsequent academic career. His native social environment is only mentioned at the very end of the book when discussing how certain dispositions associated with his origins help determine his intellectual practice. If he alludes in snippets to his childhood and experience as a class defector, transfuge, he never devotes sustained attention to why he excelled academically and enjoyed a social trajectory so different from the children of small-scale farmers, artisans, and tradesmen with whom he attended primary schools. Bourdieu's opponent might think that he deliberately obscures the issue because it casts doubt on his theory. This is not the case, since he himself arose from exception. While he rejects the idea of free will and its strain of voluntarist illusions, Bourdieu never regards reproduction as a matter of destiny or an iron law. In The Inheritors, he and Passeron asserts that social factors of class differentiation do not take the form of a mechanical determinism. And they consider two types of exceptions. In the first place, inheritors do not always preserve and cultivate their legacy. They can waste their heritage showing dilettantish attitudes in school or extravagant spending in society, leading eventually to their ruin. Secondly, Bourdieu and Passeron observe that some children from disadvantaged backgrounds manage not to be eliminated in the educational selection process. They attribute this to greater adaptability to the exigencies of teaching and a supportive family environment. Even though the authors do not go into the phenomenon in depth, they encourage further research by emphasizing, quotation, the need for more detailed study of the causes or reasons which govern these exceptional destinies, end of quotation. That is why the logic of the theory of reproduction requires us to examine counterexamples to obtain a fuller understanding of their status and scope. In line with Bourdieu and Passeron, we have to pay attention to what I call non-reproduction. To prevent any misunderstanding, the meaning and the value of non have to be precised. In strictly logical terms, negation may express contradiction or contrariness. In the case of a contradictory opposition, reproduction and non-reproduction cannot coexist. Consequently, if one is true, the other is necessarily false. Alternatively, in the case of a contrary opposition, the two theses are compatible. Regarding our case, non-reproduction does not contradict reproduction. They coexist, since it is at the same time that in a given society, a high percentage of children reproduce the family social trajectory, and a small percentage do not reproduce it. When I speak of a non-reproduction, I do not intend to contest the existence of social reproduction, but to shed new light on it by examining it from its margins. A theory of social non-reproduction, therefore, does not aim to refute, but to complete Bourdieu's thought and to provide nuances. In this respect, we must, in the second part, exercise a right of inventory and distance ourselves from Bourdieu's conceptual apparatus, in particular on 3 points. The formulation of the problem of non-reproduction in terms of exceptional destiny, the notion of class defectors, and the role played by Habitus, and more particularly cleft Habitus. First, exception. The change of social class is rare, but it is not exceptional. The percentage of children who reproduce the family social trajectory varies depending on the policy pursued in the different countries. In France, for 30 years, the rate has been 17%. In America and United Kingdom, the percentage is higher. Conversely, in Scandinavia, it is lower thanks to a social policy more favorable to popular classes. Around 30% of cases of non-reproduction is a low rate, but it's not something exceptional. Moreover, it has nothing to do with an anomaly, for the phenomenon of non-reproduction does not escape the laws of reproduction or stands outside the social system. It is a product of it. It is the reason where the term exception is not quite appropriate. It suggests something outlaw, miraculous, that gives rise to a mythology of giftedness, luck, or merit. Sometimes Bourdieu speaks of himself as miraculous, but we have to distinguish subjective feeling with objective reality to prevent for superstitious attitudes and fascination for the extraordinary destinies. To analyze the phenomena of non-reproduction, it is necessary to neutralize it, because the point is not to overestimate or downplay those peculiar cases for political ends, but to understand them. In this regard, it would be appropriate to refer to them objectively by subsetting them under a concept without any evaluative connotations. In this regard, the word transfuge, defector, used by Bourdieu to describe his social trajectory is suggestive, but I'm not quite convinced by the term, for it's suggestive because it evokes a transfer that has been made and the personal feeling of being a stranger or an intruder in a new milieu. Yet we must notice that usually Bourdieu did not use the expression transfuge de classe, class defector, as we always say nowadays, but transfuge, defector, simply. It sounds more like a metaphorical term intended to express his subjective experience than a conceptual one. This evocative image of defector remains, however, a bit inadequate. Firstly, it is not value-free, inasmuch as it connotes flight, desertion, and even treason. It cannot have the objective status of a concept. A defector is someone who has changed allegiance, trading one country or political party for another, and always falls under suspicion as a renegade. The notion is often imprinted with dolorism today. It induces the idea that those who change class are tormented or are at least uncomfortable. But it is not systematically the case. Many social climbers are proud of their new status and have no qualms when it comes to exploiting their neighbor in turn. Secondly, this notion of defector is too restrictive and cannot include all the cases of non-reproduction. The change of social class does not automatically take the form of a flight with loss and uproar, or desertion with its procession of guilt and betrayal, or a transplantation into an environment hostile stranger. It is not always a solitary escape or an illegitimate intrusion. Social ascent can be a collective project which is orchestrated and approved by the native milieu or the dominant class. Children often accomplish parental wishes for a better life. They are the voice of their parents' frustrated desires, and they tend to satisfy their desire for revenge on the poverty, shame, and stigmatization. Understanding non-reproduction means thinking a trajectory that is not solitary, but in solidarity with a familiar or social milieu that in a way prompts or authorizes it. Besides, the sustaining milieu is not necessarily the native one. Social mobility can be encouraged by the dominant class, not out of philanthropy, but from a need to train an elite of specialists and supervisors to satisfy its economic and social interests. The best pupils from popular strata then form a pool upon which it is free to draw. So the trajectory is not always a solitary escape. It can be a form of pushing by the native milieu or pulling by the dominant class. Then, in many cases, the qualifier defector is not appropriate. That is why it is necessary to coin a new word to embrace all the cases under one concept and to avoid terms or metaphor containing a moral charge, such as promotion, demotion, social climbers, social failures, etc. Naming is first of all bringing into existence, giving legal status to real life by recognizing their specificity without normative judgment. In this context, it seems to me more relevant to speak of a transclass when referring to an individual or group who moves from one class to another in two-way direction. The prefix trans does not suggest supersession or ascent, but merely transition, switching to another side. It is synonymous with the Latin word trans, which means across, and describes transit between two classes. Designating these beings as transclass was therefore giving them an objective existence, taking them out of the mode of being a little shameful, marginal, or sulfurous, which remains attached to the notion of class defector. The concept of transclass, of course, includes the figures of the defectors as a particular case, but cannot be reduced to it. Let us come now to the habitus and the necessary redefinition of his role. The trajectory of transclasses cannot obviously be explained by habitus alone, nor by a first determined cause that could be presented as the cause. It is the product of an arrangement of multiple causes, a chain of woven determination that I call the ingenium or complexion, in line with Spinoza. The term complexion comes from the Latin complexio, coined from the prefix con, with, and the root ex, derived from the past participle of plectere, to tie, to twine. Clearly, it expresses the complex intertwinings of threads that compose the fabric of an existence and attach it to that of others. The trajectory of transclass is unintelligible in the absence of a conception of complexion that grasps the thread of common and singular determination intertwined in an individual through a lived experience or encounters where a private and collective history intersect. The constitution of the complexion includes a complex combinatory logic where political orientation, economic and educational institution, childhood, family history, place among siblings, gender, race, sexual orientation, religion, emotional life, relational friendships or love are integrated into examination of the trajectory. This conception of complexion is based on an understanding of the interconnection of causes and the constitutive bond that defines being with the others. It breaks with a substantialist conception of human beings as independent beings and invites us to avoid taking habitus as the exclusive explanatory model in accounting for social conduct. Social habitus incline human beings to reproduce the way of life of their class and do not always make it possible to explain subtle differences and the transclass migration. Non-reproduction runs counter the forms of social conditioning and the system of enduring disposition they generate. It is characterized by an aptitude for diverging from the dominant schemas and overcoming the obstacles of repetition or imprisonment in the same. This aptitude is not innate, it is the fruit of a singular combination of causes of an other arrangement of determinisms. Yet it does not abolish them. Rather than contradicting them, it counteracts them, and the rarity of non-reproduction attests to the power of reproduction. That is why analysis of complexion does not involve disqualifying social habitus, but including it in a larger complex of determination. At the crossroads between two worlds, the transclass experience a double distance from the native milieu and from the nouveau milieu, as Bourdieu said. Condemned to the big gap between often incompatible worlds, a transclass is necessarily worked by open or subterranean contradiction. Having lived and shared the history of the dominate, she has passed to the other side of the barrier. She experiences the class struggle in itself, so to speak, and is haunted by a dialectic of opposites without any guarantee that they might be harmonized and that the oscillations might result into some kinds of equilibrium. Then, the coincidence of opposites can underlie what Bourdieu calls the cleft habitus. If this habitus, which is constructed out of a dual experience, such as election to the educational aristocracy and popular origins, inclines to the reconciliation of opposites, tensions persist, bound up with the discrepancy between lofty consecration and humble social extraction. The concept of cleft habitus is very enlightening. Nevertheless, it cannot be the key of all transclasses complexion, for it is too monolithic and static. It is the reason why the concept of fluctuatio animi, vacillation of mind, borrowed from Spinoza, is preferable, for it is more fluid and flexible, and it includes a wide range of postures. Fluctuatio animi refers to the state of mind engendered by two opposite affects. It is an expression of ambivalence, and as long as the conflict is not absorbed, it induces hesitation and swings from one condition to another. The modes of the conflict resolution are various. They can include the cleavage, as Bourdieu said, but also the triumph of one posture, diverse arrangements or compromises, hybridizations of the habitus, miscegenations, and a wide range of fluctuating attitudes that cannot be reduced to cleft habitus. the initial dispositions are modified and recast in contact with the new milieu, it yields a reconfiguration that is not reducible to an addition of prior habitus, but takes the dynamic form of a constant deconstruction and reconstruction through the tensions of transition. The transclass can only be understood in the transitional dynamic, where she experiences a transidentity and the dissolution of the personal and social self. She is out of place on the border between inside and outside, in an in-between. To conclude, the existence of transclasses is in fact subject not so much to a logic of exception as one of divergence. The non-reproduction of the native social model is in no way an anomaly which would impart a separate status, the aura of the hero or the ostracism of the Judas. Instead, it is the radicalization of the work of difference within the same. Thus, any existence might be defined by a practice of differential divergence, because it always oscillates between the two figures, minimal and maximal, of conformism and originality vis-à-vis the given norms. The transclass does not evade the rule, and her trajectory can be understood in line with the distance she introduces from the habitus of the class starting point and the class destination. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chantal. So I'd like to start like Emily did this morning by offering participants a chance to probe echoes that they've heard in each other's presentations or points of dissensus. It seems to me that there are both in your presentation, and I wonder if you'd like to start engaging with those. And may I ask Emmanuel perhaps to, oh, sorry, Chantal?
I have a question for Emmanuel. Is it possible?
Yes, of course.
Yes. Is for you the existence of the habitus can be an objection to the idea that gender is a performance, just like, for instance, can we imagine that Bourdieu's habitus can be an objection to Judith Butler theory? Gender is just a performance for you.
Pretty much the question I was going to ask you.
That's not an easy question. And I work with colleagues working more with the concept of socialization, the fact that we can maybe think together dispositions, habitus, and performance, because it's also a question of temporality. And this has been evoked as well, because you can, of course, we talked about the hysteresis effect. The habitus can be transformed, but it's not that flexible. But sometimes you also have strategic performances. It depends on the context, on who you're talking to, what's at stake in this interaction on a daily basis. So it's I think it's not incompatible. It just means that we can. I mean, it's not contradictory for me. We can work both with habitus and performance, gender performance.
Many thanks.
Muriel?
Yes, maybe to jump on this question, this was also something, if I, when you said what is common and what is different between what we said, I think that it depends on what you're looking at, because, for example, when Mustafa is saying race is performed or gender is performed, which is, we can either look at this performance or at the way we are done and made and shaped to be able to perform race or gender or class, or so it's not incompatible. I do agree with Emmanuel on that. So it's a question of what you're looking at and what you can prove also, which is something that I think is also an interesting question. If to ask whether we're talking on a theoretical level or we want to administrate the proof, as Jacquet would say, of what we're saying. And so what would be each of us, what would be the best way to do that, and where to find empirical proof of these processes. But in fact, it's not so much a difference as or a conflict as things that we are looking or not, well, interests of well, so I would have much more to say, and thank you very much to all of you for your presentation, but don't want to, so I'll go back to my screen.
Thank you, Muriel. Well, yeah, questions from the Emily?
Okay. I have a question for Mustafa that was in relation perhaps to Chantal, which would bring us back a little bit to the morning panel. This would concern the medium of transracial. You mentioned at the end the intrapsychic and how transclass could be enlarged with a more psychoanalytic approach. Certainly we're in an era of affect studies. I'm not quite sure where that falls explicitly with respect to psychoanalysis. It's certainly part of it. But I guess what I'm asking is where the discursive field fits in, because it seems to me that the whole notion in affect studies of racial harming and microaggressions and the micro violences that occur through verbal and discursive encounters and have somehow often ignored, at least in an American context, they've ignored class, or they don't take it on. It's as if it's somehow a separate discussion. And so it seems to me what you were opening up here is a channel between some of Chantal's work and your own, but it would connect back to some of what we were looking at earlier with discursive social harming that would be in the space of the transracial.
Well, I think what I was referring to is not incompatible with that, but discursive racial harming is always going to be, there's going to be some point of contact with intrapsychic structures and processes. And one person's discursive, harmful comment could be another person's, it rolls off their back. So it's important to understand what there is in one's psychical nature and psychical economy that makes it particularly meaningful to hear certain words, patients. So when I speak of psychoanalysis, I don't mean that we're interested exclusively in intrapsychic processes, but rather how intrapsychic processes and interpersonal and social processes can work together in different instances. And you asked about Jacquet's concepts. They can fit together in complexion. That seems like a useful concept for understanding how all this comes together.
Chantal, you have a word
Uh,
to answer? We cannot hear you. You're muted.
The concept of affect can make the link between psychoanalysis and social behaviors, because its definition in Spinoza's philosophy implies that an affect is a modification that that increase or diminish the power of acting of our body and correlatively of our mind. So an affect is always linked with the milieu, with social determinations, and is not only psychological abstract process. It implies the relationship between external causes, social, religious, familial causes, and the individual. So there are not, we can make a link between them.
Yeah, please.
Can I ask Mustafa a question?
Yes.
I think you know what I'm going to ask, but would you say, from your point of view, that we can say that we can change race like we can change sex? I ask this question because I work on this subject with colleagues working on in the field of sociology of race. We read the book of Rogers Brubaker on the Dolezal affair. So she passed for a Black woman for all her life, and it was revealed in the press that her parents were white. It was a huge scandal. And he says in this book that it's easier to it's easier to think that we can change sex, but changing race is like scandalous in this affair. It's like she's been betraying people all her life, and she said, "Well, I am trans race. I am a Black woman. I identify as a Black woman," and people are more shocked in this case than in the case of transgender trajectories. So, I mean, it's about also about the question of doing gender and doing race. We can, with our practices, acts, and performances, do race and gender, but we are maybe done differently by gender and race, which is the articulation between habitus and agency and performance. So what do you think about this question?
You know, I didn't tell you what Charles Mills says in relation to his Skylar machine example. So does he think that he's the one who brings this up? Does he think that these individuals are changing their race who use the Skylar machine to go from being Black to being white? He said so. So he's setting up basically a threefold distinction in his paper between realist approaches to race that say that's natural, it's just it's your essence, that's who you are. Between those and subjectivist and relativist ideas that say you can be whatever you want to be, and then a third position in the middle, which is social constructionist. And he says, well, I hold to a social constructionist understanding of race, and by that understanding of race, I lean towards saying that they've changed their race. So I don't know. I hold to a social constructionist view too, but I probably agree with him. But yeah.
Can I jump in there? Because what's particularly ironic, and I think Rogers Brubaker makes this point, is that we tend to be more inclined generally to accept that race is constructed. But as opposed to the sex gender issue, where precisely gender had to be created to acknowledge that for some people, sex is still much more biological. And yet, in that area where we accept mobility, as opposed to in the racial question, where we all agree it's constructed, but it's problematic if people are moving between. So there's a kind of paradox there. So the question then becomes, it's also about it's almost like as if we need a reception theory for these questions. It's not just about experience, about what a particular individual wants or feels or is trying to do. It's also about how the whole social context ecosystem around is reading them and is accepting them. So it gets to be, I mean,
That's the social construction.
well, it's social constructionist, but it's not enough. There's something else. And so what I think one of the big questions is the question of resistance to. There we get back to affects, to the unconscious, and to how these cannot be processes completely explained solely by kind of agentistic, have to be embedded in logics that escape. I'm putting it out as a provocation.
We'll take two questions together, and for the sake of time, we'll have three questions, and for the sake of time, those will have to be the last for this panel because it's already 3:40. Yes, we'll take them together. So you go first, and please make notes.
Thank you for this. This is an open question. I found it interesting that a lot of the discussion was about people moving between kind of positions within the social space, but less of a discussion of how social space moves and changes people's positions, even though they aren't necessarily doing anything. I'm thinking of the Backwoods Ball, and I'm thinking of the making of the economic habitus. So I'd be interested in kind of in these orders that we've talked about. But what does it mean to be middle class where the middle class is shrinking, right? You think about changes in the racial order in the US, you think that the term people of color that's emergent now and kind of changing the ways in which people think about race. Like, what does it mean? What happens when the social space moves around you and changes your position without you necessarily having to work?
We'll take the two additional questions. It's a great question. One that by design we excluded from the panel, but in fact, it's also a central question. Thank you for asking. Helen and then Giselle.
I think what I'm going to say might be very obvious, but just in connection to this question of race and gender, just seems to me important to bring into that discussion the fact that so many, particularly trans people and also people are assigned by the other from very early. They are read as acting like a girl or acting like a boy. So I just thought maybe also bringing it seems like a very important distinction with the example given of I'm forgetting her name, but saying she's transracial. That seems like a critical difference in this relentless assignation by the other of what the trans person is as a child.
The question in a way connects to the previous one. Giselle?
Yes, thank you for a very rich panel. So first, the issue of performance and disposition reminded me of the Bourdieu's critique of Goffman using Sartre's description of the cafe waiter for his role sociology, and saying you must be Sartre sitting at the cafe to imagine that you have the liberty not to come back tomorrow, not to wake up and go back. So of course the dispositions restrict the possibilities of performance. There are things you cannot perform, and you know that usually. So I was thinking, so very rich panel. I missed a little the issue of because passing is related to symbolic violence. Why do you pass? Because you consider that is the thing to desire, right? And so it results from domination, and the term domination didn't appear so much. It's the result of social situations of class, gender, slavery, colonialism, which makes the dominant desirable. And the issue of a scandal that you just mentioned, the Beaubatie case, is because there was a reversal of the stigma, and now Black is beautiful, and you speak of cultural oppression, but it's related to a very specific context. I mean, it would have been different 50 years ago. And I was thinking we had with Emmanuel, we have at our center a workshop on domination, and we were talking last time about these issues of social pay of gender. And I was really thinking we should distinguish the societies where crossing boundaries is forbidden and those where it's authorized, but there are moral sanctions, because it's different. I mean, when you do the passing in Nella Larson, it's forbidden. If she's caught, she's done. I mean, it's a social death. It's different when you get some moral sanctions, which are more or less understandable and differ according to the milieu. And then what I liked also in the comparison is that there is a difference between class, gender, and race with regard to the position in society as a minority or majority. In class, the majority is the working class, and you have a minority. In race, it's an issue of minority. In gender, it's not an issue nor of minority, nor. So maybe we have some things to think about it when we compare the three. And then just to remind that in general, in sociology, we don't have exceptions. We have probabilities, and the probabilities change according to and this was alluded to, the social space and the social structure. So when Bourdieu described in the 60s, the access, he calculated in terms of probability of accessing a university at his time, and the chance to access university was 80 times higher for dominant classes, children of dominant classes compared to working classes. Today, with 80% to the access of university, of course, apparently it has changed, but then there are all these mechanisms of inner exclusion within the university. And when you teach, I did 30 years ago, taught in sociology, which is the lowest hierarchical social recruitment in France. We have students from coming from vocational higher school education, and you know that at the end of the first year, 70% will be out of the system. So they access, but just to be rejected immediately. So what does it mean to access university? And then we have to rethink the mechanism of exclusion within the system. And then the very last point, Mustafa, to the psychoanalysis, and I think you have a strong case here. Reworking and writing the entry misrecognition for the dictionary, I suddenly understood how misrecognition is central to Bourdieu's theory in general, and all the reflection about the repressed censorship form as a repression, symbolic violence as misrecognition. So it's very, very central in the theories.
Thank you. I'm mindful that we have another wonderful panel starting at 4 and that it's 3:47. So I'll ask everyone if you have a comment in answer to the things that have been said, and we'll finish with this. Muriel? Maybe you don't have anything to say.
Well, or too many things to say, actually. So that's my problem. But maybe just the idea that the difference between gender, class, and race, I always feel that I'm kind of a spin doctor of socialization. So any problem I want to put in terms of the sociogenesis of dispositions. But the thing is, the difference is not, to me, it's not a question of minority or majority or being assigned as one of the question being assigned as a it's to incorporate dispositions that will be gendered, racialized or classed disposition. And the question is, for me, is to try and understand how what can be like a racial disposition that would be the same as a class disposition, since habitus is like a second nature. And so there is this idea that sociology of, for example, race or gender fluidity, as Mustafa said, is more on the constructivist, I mean, is kind of a substantially a constructivist sociology. So the question, to me, some of these questions are not the one I try to work on. So that which is really the production, the building of people, and not what they're doing, not the inequality of their trajectories. And so it seems to me that the question of habitus can be, in fact, like a auberge espagnole, quite where we're bringing lots of theoretical questions that are sometimes not interesting, but here, all the ones that have been raised are very interesting, but it's not always the question of the sociogenesis of the habitus, which I am quite obsessed with. That just, sorry, I was too long, but well.
Thank you, Muriel. Chantal?
Just a remark about what Giselle said. It's very interesting to notice that the violence of domination is sometimes totally hidden by the searchers. In France, the symbolic violence is visible because of the system of the grandes écoles, high schools. For instance, an Italian searcher told me that the social mobility is a French problem because we have a very selective educational system. And he says that in Italy, there is no problem. In reality, in Italy, everybody can have access to the university. But the social mobility is lower than in France because, in fact, if you have a diploma, the diploma is not useful because it's the net of relation which is determinant to have a social position. So you can have a social mobility by the university, but in fact, it's stopped because of the social capital. So we have to think about social symbolic violence, but economic and social violence dissimulate on symbolic discriminations.